Now we're going to ask short, concise questions, and it would help us if your answers were the same. We want to learn. We want to learn. The objective of this session is not to conduct a show trial. We want to learn.
We Want to Learn is the first main song committee where Committee Chairman Bernard Jenkins MP and the other members set out the main objectives of the hearing to the key witnesses Alan Yentob and Camila Batmanghelidjh.
And now we're going to ask short, concise questions, and it would help us if your answers were the same. And if I feel you're going on a bit too long, I'll pull you up so we get through all of the questions that we want to ask. So we get through all of the questions that we want to ask. Short and concise.
I'll leave it there because we're running out. So that is pretty much the first song from committee. The Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee takes oral evidence on Whitehall's relationship with Kids Company, which I have to say is the best musical I've ever seen about a Public Accounts Committee investigation into financial mismanagement at a UK charity. It's in the top one, definitely. And this was at the Donmar Warehouse this summer. And what it was like other recent theatre productions, taking verbatim evidence and transcripts from the committee at which Bernard Jenkins, Kate Hoey, Paul Flynn and other MPs questioned the Chief Exec of Kids Company, Camila Batmanghelidjh, and the Chair of the Board of Trustees, Alan Yentob, about what had gone on in the summer of 2015 that led to Kids Company, quite famously in the UK voluntary sector, closing its doors. And perhaps best illustrated by this cartoon from the Times of Camila Batmanghelidjh's own personal brand, exemplified by many people through her clothes and her quite exuberant personality being washed away as the rain of truth comes in. What I want to talk about today is do a quick bit on the timeline of Kids Company and what happened in the summer of 2015. But I want to row back and go back into the annals of sociological literature to focus on the work of Max Weber, particularly Weber's work on charisma and how we can think of that in terms of charismatic leadership, and how that might give us a framework for understanding what went on at Kids Company and other lessons for the voluntary sector. In order to evidence this, I did some qualitative work with various sector leaders, which I'll introduce you to. And I want to talk about the role of trustees, board and the government, but also this balance that we often run up against in voluntary sector debates about this balance between passion and professionalism. And is it possible to have both? So this is taken from the BBC, which some people, including Batmanghelidjh herself, would say is not a neutral source in this story, so there may be other things left out of it. But this is what happened over the summer of 2015. From June, local authorities start being informally told that there are financial problems at Kids Company and they should prepare themselves for an avalanche of cases in terms of child protection coming to them. You've got ministers giving a £3 million emergency grant to Kids Company to get its house in order, which the permanent secretary at the Department for Education said should not go ahead and needed a ministerial directive for that to happen. You then have an investigation about financial mismanagement and about allegations of sexual abuse from The Spectator, BBC Newsnight and BuzzFeed News. And then the charity closes in August with lots of allegations swirling around. And later in October, Camila Batmanghelidjh and Alan Yentob giving evidence to that committee. I think what's important to remember is this happened over the summer. I think if this happens at any other time of the political year, this is not a massive story. People are bored. Journalists are bored in August. And this gave them something interesting and sexy to write about. It touched a lot of different pies. There was a lot of, it was about relationships with ministers, it was about financial irregularity, and it was about the bringing low of someone who various elements of British society had not liked for a long time, both Alan Yentob and Camila Batmanghelidjh. I do not want to make this in any way personal. It is not, to centre this on Batmanghelidjh too much would be incredibly improper. But a lot of the criticisms of Kids Company do revolve around things that Camila Batmanghelidjh had herself said. One thing, she said that she was good at bullying. She was good at bullying government into giving Kids Company more funds. It had received £41.5 million in state funding over the 13 years of its existence, at one point getting a third, I believe, of the Department for Education's discretionary spending budget. She also wrote to David Cameron saying that there will be riots on the streets of South London if Kids Company's funding is withdrawn, because so many of these psychologically damaged and desperate poverty situation they were in would lead to riots akin to the 2011 August riots. Considering that Kids Company was really a very local charity working in South London, Peckham, and also with very minor elements of outreach in Liverpool and not Bristol, it seems odd that it would be so prominent within child protection and children's charities. There was a story that the committee belabour, I think, but bring up a lot, saying that one child was given £76,000 worth of support over a certain period of time. Famous stories of children being bought shoes, children up until their mid-30s being supported by the charity, because Batmanghelidjh, in her book, which I was reading on the train on the way down here, says is important that actually these psychological defects do not go away in adulthood. And you also have the problem, and I think this one probably hits home in terms of voluntary sector leadership, the charity only had reserves of 1 week. It had, when the receivers came in at the end, it had £400,000 of cash available. That was equivalent to 1 week's revenue. Given that we've just seen the VSSN revenue is covering a year or so or more of expenditure, to have 1 week is considered pretty difficult when charities are advised to have between 3 and 6 months worth of funding. And Batmanghelidjh herself was sort of held up as a very interesting figure. As Quinton Letts in the Daily Mail wrote about her, she arrived at Parliament yesterday wrapped in textiles of 100 colours. The Spectator described her as that garishly dressed lard mountain of Persian self-regard, and the Sunday Times an explosion in a Nigerian sofa factory, which is obviously the sexist and racist bilge that we should call it. And she says of that, I do not mind these descriptions. The kids say worse, and I find the inventiveness of the insults funny. But they add to a perception that a person of my size and dress cannot possibly have ordered thinking. The assumption is that a charismatic leader runs her organisation on a whim. It is another inversion of the truth, which leads us to the purpose of this book, which is subtitled The Truth. She mentions a charismatic leader there. So I want to talk about Max Weber, obviously one of the godfathers of sociology, argued that, and this is very brief, that authority, people's authority in social structures and institutions comes from 3 places. Traditional sources, long-standing order maintained through customs, rational legal authority, the propensity of courts and the justice system to make sure that there's a sort of normative order of how natural law works. But most interestingly for us here, maybe charismatic authority. Usually, in Weber's sense, applied to an individual who can get others to bend to their will through force of personality. He sees it something that sets apart the charismatic from ordinary man. They're endowed with supernatural superpowers, and they have exceptional qualities of leadership. And people are devoted to them, sometimes from inspiration and enthusiasm and hope, but also sometimes from a point of despair. And she writes very movingly in the book of kids who felt that she was the first person in their lives to love them. That actually that sense of devotion, you could see, was built up through Kids Company's foundation. Problem with charisma, as Weber sees it, is that it's very irrational. It's very ad hoc. It's very difficult to pin down. And that means it's very unstable. And it's prone to moments of collapse and conflict. Jasper says, well, if we're talking about charisma, it's sort of demonic. The devil on your shoulder encouraging you to do certain things. Actually, most authority comes from very impersonal and rational sources. And actually, this sort of counters that. It doesn't rest on compulsion. There's very little forcing within charismatic leadership to force people to do stuff. Basically, it's about voluntary compliance. But there is a mixture of this and otherworldliness. that actually there's something different about charismatics in society, and that acts as psychosocial mechanisms to affect structural change. Charismatics are leaders. They are people who try and enact change in society, but we can't always pin down exactly how and why they're doing it. And Shmuel Eisenstadt, who's professor of sociology at University of Jerusalem, wrote in 1968 probably the best book about Weber's charismatic leaders and the problems with charismatic leaders. So I'd like you to look at this list and think about how this may apply to Camila Batmanghelidjh's ideas. So the problem with charismatics is that they disavow scientific rational calculation. And actually, decisions are based on emotional appeals and swings of the heart rather than cold, calculating decisions of the head. They operate without elaborate systems of roles, rules, and procedures to guide administrative functions. They disdain the everyday economizing of setting a budget and meeting it through regular contracts. And this was written in 1968, so a full 50 years before the events I'm talking about. Function with a lack of provision for succession. Founder syndrome, I suppose, in voluntary sector rhetoric. That actually we don't know what's going to come next. We don't know what happens after this charismatic whole leaves the organisation. And a strong tendency to destruct and decompose institutions, not liking formal institutions. If you read Kids, it is full of attacks on local authorities, social workers, teachers. Every other youth charity is labelled inept or incompetent or not seeing the full behaviour of the child, compared to Kids Company, which saw the truth. A sort of idea that no one else is possible, no one else is capable of achieving this turnaround in kids' lives apart from me. And they also try to keep control of the their creations, limiting the attempts of other people to participate. So very much wanting to keep hold of the thing that they have created, not wanting an opportunity to let outsiders in to get more information on board. At the time, 2015, I was in the middle of a qualitative project I was just interested really in doing some state of the sector style interviews. Those of you who've seen me present on this before, I promise this is the last time I will present on this data set. 23 interviews with voluntary sector leaders, workers, officials, working at a variety of organisations, either national charities or ones based locally in Sheffield. Heads of research, heads of communication, heads of fundraising, lead fundraisers, lots of chief executives, a couple of consultants. And as these interviews were going on, this crisis was happening. Kids Company was falling apart in the media day by day. There was another scandal. And so it became an interesting case study of how people in voluntary sector leadership roles saw their sector being presented. For a summer, the charity sector was big news, and they wanted to reflect on it. Some of this comes back to Camila Batmanghelidjh. But, and this is the interesting thing, surprisingly little. There is very little overall focus in these interviews about blaming Camila Batmanghelidjh herself. Well, a couple of criticisms. Our funders would try to walk away if we kind of tried and asked them to support us and we got no money in the bank. How on earth they got away with it, I've no idea. And it's had long and far-reaching effects on a lot of us. I think Kids Company across the sector has harmed us, said the chief executive of a learning disability charity. Feeling that this large, dominant charity with the ear of government had created an inaccurate sense in the general public's mind of how charities worked. I think Camila was just allowed, because of her personality, to be in the wrong role. If she was going to be chief exec, then it needs to be clear what her role was and get somebody else to be doing all the stuff, the due diligence and the governance, and they just lost sight of it all. They just chucked money at them. It was just ridiculous. So there, we're moving away from Batmanghelidjh and actually focusing on the role of trustees and the role of the government, saying that the board was inadequate. I suppose a lot of you will have seen last week the report came out, sponsored by the Charity Commission, report on taken on trust research on the role of charity trustees. And what this found was that while the charity trustees contribute an equivalent of $3.5 billion to the UK economy, overwhelmingly they are a white, middle class, male, overwhelmingly retired, too long-standing set of individuals that is limiting the sector's diversity and limiting its ability to meet the challenges of the 21st century, particularly in terms of recruiting a dynamic and diverse workforce, appealing to a diverse range of beneficiaries or volunteers, and in terms of digital literacy. And actually, most of the criticism was reserved for the Board of Trustees. One final more criticism. She had the right intentions, but probably buried her head in the sand when things didn't go right and just thought, oh, it doesn't matter. They didn't think about the longevity of what they were doing, really. She was too involved with them all being her children, and it should have been structured better. I'm going to skip the rest of that quote, but it's quite long. Actually, most of them wanted to defend her. I think that comes back to the government giving, well, yes, it sounds like quite a bit of money. In the grand scheme of things, it isn't. And in the grand scheme of other cuts that it had made to children's services, it's easy to say, yes, but look, we give to Kids Company, look at this eccentric woman that the Tories want to elevate. There was an argument, and this comes back to the problem of diversity in the sector, I think, that she was often held up as because she was the most demonstrative woman of colour that the Tories could grab hold of and hug closely, they could say, look, we are not only talking to a white section of Britain, actually look at how diverse we are. She was held up as too much of an icon and hero and representative of people of colour within the sector, rather than, and that comes back to this problem of lack of representativeness. Because if you've only got a couple of people at the top, you end up heroising and iconising them. It's very easy to do a witch hunt after the fact, to basically rubbish someone's character without knowing the full facts. She is not the only person, she can't be the only person that is culpable in that scenario. So the chief executive of a children's medical charity who had met her, had worked with her on various projects, and hadn't seen this coming, but had was completely aghast at the behaviour of Alan Yentob and the board. The board of Kids Company was made up of 6 out of the 7 board members had been there for between 8 and 12 years. Again, that's something that the Charity Commission research highlights, saying that actually a bit of turnover is more helpful. Actually, you're less likely to challenge someone if you've been close to them for that amount of time. And so that sort of level of culpability was shown quite obviously. But coming back to blaming the government, well, that's probably the biggest failure, that funding for that charity became the knee-jerk reaction of a group of anonymous Whitehall staff members who were just told, save the charity. Now, if a minister came to our charity with a £3 million payment, the rest of the hospice sector would be up in arms, because they'd be saying, why should they get it? What's so special about them? Why can't we all bid for it? No other charity was given the option of this funding. It was seen as being, this is a charity that's too important and too high profile to fall, give them the money. That's entirely wrong. It can't be right. So a sense of unfairness in terms of government. In terms of government had got too close to certain actors within the sector and actually weren't seeing the entire board. A charity that was helping a very small amount of people actually had taken far too much government funding from it. One of the big on a side note, you may remember one of the big questions about this was how many people is Kids Company actually helping? The number that Kids Company, Batmanghelidjh and Yentob regularly used was 36,000. We have 36,000 children on our books who we regularly engaged with. That's why when Kids Company collapsed, local authorities were braced for a storm of new cases and children that they had to take on in child protection issues. In fact, only 1,200 cases were passed on to local authorities when the company collapsed. So we have this idea of a mirage. The Deputy Children's Commissioner said that whenever she went to visit Kids Company, there were never any young children there. She never actually got to meet any young people. That actually the company was a bit of a shell. Tim Lawton MP said something similar, the former young persons and children's minister. On a bigger scale, this is a problem of trusteeship and boards. On our board of trustees, we've got a good board of trustees, which helps. I mean, we've got some long-standing ones who've been here 15 years or so, which has its ups or downs. Sometimes I think, I wish we could just get rid of everyone after 3 years. A lot of charities do that. You've got a maximum turn. On the other hand, it does help with history and checks of knowing who is pulling the wool over the eyes. Not that I want to, but I can't really hide anything from the trustees because they're aware of anything. I can imagine she'll have recruited the board. She'd have got people on who were whatever who she wanted. They were on it to support her as well, which is easily done. And I think Alan Yentob should come out of this with a lot of criticism. His performance at various stages during that committee hearing is quite appalling. However, also a lot of the victimisation of Mr. Yentob is, I would say, in its presentation, highly anti-Semitic at times as well. And this sort of extends into a wider debate that I know a lot of people in this room have had about the extent to which the voluntary sector has professionalised over the years. About, in Colin Rochester's term, it has lost its soul in some sense because it has become either too corporatised or too much an arm of the state. And that's, I think, a debate that people who work in charities of all sizes up and down the country are having on a day-to-day basis. This gentleman who I spoke to, head of fundraising at a very large homelessness charity, was very critical of this problem. You see people working for charities, and I don't want to be overly critical, but sometimes poor performance is excused because someone has a lot of passion. I don't think that's actually useful for the end beneficiary. He was the most strident in this opinion, saying that actually we have a responsibility to hire the best people, not those ones who want always to help the most. Well, I'm not adverse to hiring people who see this as just a job, he goes on to say. And actually, this is the balance about Kids Company. Would putting a plan in place that said we're not going to help every child who comes to us looking for help have helped, or would that have destroyed some of the passion and some of the enthusiasm of the volunteers who work there? Chief Executive of the Community Foundation told me, well, we're all passionate about what we do. Yes, okay, fine, but that can be taken advantage of if you're not careful. I think you can still be businesslike and passionate about what you do. This is what people who run their own businesses do, don't they? They're passionate about their business, but at the same time, they want to make money. So generally, the people I was speaking to were much more engaged with the idea that passion only gets you so far. Charisma only gets you so far. And the sector shouldn't be overly reliant on this nice image it has. This, in a way, goes back to our point about transparency. That I don't think it's okay for the charity sector to assume that just because we work in charity and we're all really lovely, nice people doing nice things, we should be special. This is about, do charities get listened to because they're staffed either partially or totally by people who are motivated by altruistic and non-egotistical tendencies. And actually, again, saying that's only gets us so far. One goes on to say that volunteers are not the cake, they are the cherry on the cake. And actually delivering the service is where our duty to society ends. The people I was speaking to, better, I would say, than the both almost the journalists who were investigating this story and the general public, have an understanding of how a charity operates, obviously, because they were doing it themselves. Therefore, they understood Camila Batmanghelidjh's positioning, both in terms of her relationship to power, both in terms of the fact that she'd used, as Ali talked about earlier, various strategies and tactics to get ahead in the game of the voluntary sector, but also that she came to the charity sector in a very specific way. And so therefore, I was surprised when I went through the data, they very, very much wanted to limit apportioning any blame to her for this. In fact, actually it's boards, trustees, government, all responsible. People who weren't taking their duty seriously, weren't actually thinking deeply about the structural issues at stake. Now, passion and charisma are obviously things that drive the voluntary sector. People don't volunteer or become super volunteers by giving 6, 15 or more hours a week unless they are passionate and engaged in the thing they're doing. But this incredible power that charisma has can also be very problematic. But Eisenstadt, who was critical earlier, does give us a sort of sense that maybe we should row back a little bit. Amongst the egotistical wishes of human beings, a very important part is comprised by their quest for and conception of the good society and of the quest for participation in such an order. There's nothing wrong with charismatic leadership. I suppose the title of this presentation was, there is the problem, and actually maybe there isn't much of a problem. As long as at the top of the organisation a blend of skills exist that can dampen the negatives of charisma and can add all the other technical things that need to exist. Committee, the musical, ends with a refrain from Batmanghelidjh, basically going, what about the children, what about the children, what about the children? And politically, that's a viewpoint that I have a hell of a lot of time for. Actually, why are we having a committee to investigate the collapse of a relatively small, relatively minor local charity, and not having a committee investigating record levels of child poverty in this country? And so that probably ties into large ideas about the classic left-wing critique of the charity sector in itself, but we will perhaps leave that for another time. Thank you very much.